Hello, my name is Tessa Asquith-Lamb and I'm an artist. I work at the City Arts Centre and other venues, running workshops and also leading described tours for the visually impaired. In today's video, we're going to be working on a 1920s style still life painting in acrylics. So for this you'll need a canvas board or some sort of support. You'll need some acrylic paints and a selection of brushes and of course your water pot and some lovely objects of course to paint from. Still life painting is a really good way of honing your skills and really concentrating on the dynamics between objects as you set them up. So when I was setting up the still life for this painting, I put a board at the back which I could drape some cloth over, and this was just a cardboard folio that I'd put up and then draped some cloth over, and then I'm moving around the objects in the background. So I've got a blue and white vase which is really beloved of still life artists. I've got some tulips. I've got a crumple of white fabric that's really going to show up the colours and emphasise the shadows under things. And I've got a really beautiful fan which is gold on one side and silver on the other. And I've also got a lemon. If you think about these objects as being characters on a stage, you'd think that the vase would be quite a kind of leading lady and right at the forefront and really taking up a lot of area on the stage. But don't forget that little lemon, which is also a really important character because of its really zinging bright colour. So move around your characters on the stage of your still life until you're really happy with the composition. Then sketch this out first, maybe in pencil first, and then what I've done is I've started to put in this dark blue background, bluish kind of black background shadows and also lines around the objects. This is a painting style called cloisonnism, and what it does is emphasising the areas around an object which you're then going to fill in with colour. It looks a bit like stained glass windows, I suppose, and it becomes a little more subtle than this later on. So I've got my areas of shadow going in, and I've got my my basic kind of structure. It's all there at the beginning, and I've already laid the groundwork for the darker areas that I'm going to put in first. So we'll wait for the next step to see some of that bright colour go in. So for our next stage, as you can see, I've blocked in the major areas of colour and I'm respecting those lines that I painted in earlier. But where I want to really emphasise a shape, like under the lemon, I've left that line quite sort of thick and dense. And in other areas where I want the lines to kind of be a bit more subtle, I've brought the paint really close up to those lines. So at this stage, you're just feeling your way around the panel and just working out which bits you want to sort of stand out and be really intense and which bits you want to just be a little bit more subtle. In terms of the paints, I'll show you what I'm using. So I'm using Mars Black and Titanium White. I'm using cadmium yellow in the main part, but a tiny bit of lemon yellow, but be really careful with lemon yellow because it's really kind of acidy and kind of really intense. You've got to be careful with that one. Sometimes it's just too bright. I'm using yellow ochre, a very useful colour for toning down things. I found it useful for the gold of the fan. And the background I'm using mostly ultramarine. The red I'm using is a cadmium red, and I'm also using some burnt umber, which is down at this bottom area for that kind of wooden tabletop. So these colours I'm mixing on my palette here. And the brushes I'm using a square-ended brush like this and a round brush, and I'm also using a really big brush for the background. This is about kind of an inch across. And I'm putting in these tones and I'm keeping my paint quite thick and I'm just sort of following those lines. And if it goes over the lines, I'm not worrying too much about it because I'm going to be working into this. This is a really complex area of the painting. Tulip leaves have that weird sort of squeaky feel to them and they all kind of curl around each other. So this is quite a tricky area really, and I'm going to have to sort of work into it I think a little bit if I want it to be really kind of intricate. I'm going to see how I feel about that part. I've not even started on the pattern on the vase. I feel that'll be kind of in the next stage. I'm really happy with how this is working though, as this kind of snaky shape that's leading your eye into the picture. And the fan's kind of leading your eye down to that lemon, which is the real kind of star down at the bottom here. I want this lemon to be quite kind of zingy and bright, just really quite intense. So I've left quite kind of thick yellow paint on there. This at the background is looking quite muted. I might want to sort of bring that out a little bit more. But at this moment in time, I'm just sort of building up these layers of paint whilst kind of keeping that underlying kind of painted sort of outline that I had before. So the next stage is really to sort of go in with a slightly finer brush, adding a few shadows and some highlights and some more details. But I'm not going to put all the finishing touches on just yet. I'm going to just sort of work up some areas where I want, say, the pattern to be a little bit more intricate, and work on this kind of swathe of fabric a little bit more, perhaps put in some grey tones in amongst the fabric just to give it a little bit more sort of structure, and put in some more details on the fan. So we'll come back once I've had a go at putting in those details. So as you can see, I've now added a lot more detail to this picture, and I'm just going to add a little bit more and emphasize some of the shadows and some of the really sort of more intricate parts, particularly on the leaves and the tulips. So for this, I've got my little brush, a tiny little brush, and I'm going to use some white mixed with a tiny bit of black, so I've got a little bit of a greyish tone, and I'm just going to add some little details here at the crinkly sort of edges of the tulips, where they kind of just have that kind of almost frilly quality right on the edges. Just going to add that in first, around there. The tulips themselves have got a little hint of yellow in them, so I'm going to make them slightly yellowy green. As they open, of course, tulips move about and bend about, so it might be a good idea to take a photo of them in one position, because if you leave their still life overnight, the next morning they could have all kind of moved overnight as they do. And I'm just going to emphasize individual petals now in these tulips. I've got a little reference photo as well as the real ones over there, because as I say, they change over time a little bit. Now this one on the right hand side has got really sort of crinkly edges. As it's opened, they've become almost like a peony, like a really kind of beautiful peony shape. So I'm trying to just show sort of the more crinkly quality that one's got. And then down the edges of some of the petals, there's a kind of greenish vein, which I'm just going to sort of indicate slightly. And this wasn't really sort of visible earlier. This seems to have sort of developed as the tulips have opened, like that. Now I'm going to just work on the stems now with my finer brush. I've got some green that I'm mixing up down here. And I want it to be quite a fine line, because there's a lovely kind of fineness to those shape of that tulip. Just bring that down like that. This one. And this one here. And when I work into my background, I can come up quite close to that to make it really kind of more visible. I'm going to work into these leaves a little bit more, especially I really like this one that's kind of bending forward. I'm going to just highlight the edge of that one a little bit more, and how it kind of creeps over the edge of that vase, like that. So I'm just kind of emphasising some of these edges of the leaves. And pay really special attention to where things kind of point in a painting, because the leaves themselves are kind of all pointing upwards and this is pointing down. So think about being really careful when you're at the edges of things, and think about which way they're pointing. This background behind here I feel could be a bit darker blue behind this area here, so I might just go a little bit darker there. I think it could take it just a bit darker behind here. And when I'm putting my blue on, I'm just sort of also tidying up that leaf a little bit there as I go around that corner. So you can kind of, if you're not quite happy with an edge, you can use this time when you're adding a little bit of extra shadow just to sort of reinforce an edge shape, like just make that a little bit more rounded around there. Come down here, and that will just really emphasise the sort of delicacy of that tulip stem there. So use putting your background in as a good chance to just enhance things like that. You can see I've done quite a lot of work on the fan. I've been putting in some little details. It's got a kind of like little twisted tree stump and then little cherry blossoms on it here. So I've just picked them out too with a tiny little brush. It's really tempting, if you like me and like detail, to go a bit over the top and do every single little bit, but you have to kind of pull back a bit, because any areas of really kind of intense detail like that are really going to zoom your eye straight in. So try and think about where you want that detail and where it works. I think it's okay to have a little bit of detail here and obviously on the vase, but there's other areas that I'm going to kind of leave quite loose. So we'll come back once I've just finished the kind of finishing touches on this. So this is the finished painting, and I've just been doing some really small highlights and changes, and it's at this stage when you can just sort of go too far, or you can just pull back and think it's finished. And it's really important not to overwork things, especially if you're using this kind of very loose brush strokes, and don't do too much. So I'll point out just some of the last little bits and pieces that I changed. I've just narrowed down the darkness around this lemon here, just to bring that forward a bit, because it was a little bit too harsh around the top, so I've changed that. I've reddened the sticks of the fan, because in real life they're a kind of red kind of lacquer. So I've reddened those, and that's helped because they're a bit too black before, and they've gone a much more sort of subtle colour, and they really stand out nicely against the white. I've also just added a few little highlights in amongst the tulips here, but I'm really happy with the way that's working and the way that those kind of lush kind of green shapes work against each other. So I really hope that you'll have a go at doing one of these still lives at home. I just wanted to show you before we finish this little painting. This is a little sort of sketch painting that I did when I was doing the prep for this. And this is the same fan and obviously a lemon, but this has got a red background. And just to show you the difference that having a different coloured background can make, and the intensity of that red, it was really kind of overpowering. And in the end I went for a blue background because that seemed to fit with the lemon and fit with the mood of it. But if you want, you can try working on sort of little sketches like this, little small paintings, before you do your bigger painting, and then sometimes these can work out really well, and you might really like those as well. So this is the finished painting. I'll just move it forward a little bit. And I hope you all have a go at home and really enjoy painting in this 1920s style.